Short course on proliferation financing. This is a free course from LearningTabs. The objectives of this course are: by the end of this course, participants will grasp the concept of proliferation financing, PF, and its global impact, understand the international legal framework and obligations related to PF, identify key risk indicators and typologies associated with PF, analyze real-world case studies and understand the financial mechanisms used in PF, implement best practices to detect, monitor, and report PF activities in financial institutions. Let's grasp the concept of proliferation financing and its global impact. What are the foundations of proliferation financing? Let's understand what is proliferation financing. Proliferation financing refers to the financial support provided to individuals, organizations, or states involved in the development, production, or acquisition of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, including nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. This type of financing is aimed at facilitating the spread of these dangerous technologies and is considered a serious threat to international security. Key aspects of proliferation financing include support for WMD programs, providing funds to entities engaged in the research, development, or production of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. Technology transfer, financing the acquisition of technology, materials, or expertise necessary for the development of WMDs. Procurement networks, funding networks or intermediaries that help procure components or raw materials used in WMD programs. Diversion of resources, channeling financial resources in ways that support clandestine WMD activities, often through complex transactions to disguise the true nature of the funding. International trade, using international trade channels to finance WMD programs, including through the sale of dual-use goods that have both civilian and military applications. State and non-state actors. Both state and non-state actors can be involved in proliferation financing. States may support allies or proxy groups, while non-state actors might be engaged in illicit activities to further their own agendas. Why is proliferation financing a global threat? Proliferation financing undermines international peace and security and enables rogue states or non-state actors to access WMDs. Efforts to combat proliferation financing involve implementing legal frameworks, establishing laws and regulations that criminalize and sanction proliferation financing activities, aligning with international standards. Financial sanctions, enforcing targeted financial sanctions against individuals, entities, and countries involved in proliferation activities. Interagency cooperation, enhancing collaboration among law enforcement agencies, intelligence services, and financial institutions to share information on potential proliferation activities. International cooperation, working with global bodies like the United Nations Financial Action Task Force (FATF) and international allies to monitor and combat proliferation financing. Public-private partnerships, engaging financial institutions and other private sector players to enhance their understanding of proliferation financing risks and improve compliance efforts. Continuous monitoring and reporting, Implementing transaction monitoring systems that flag suspicious activities and ensure the timely reporting of suspicious transactions, STRs, related to proliferation financing. International legal frameworks for PF includes but not limited to United Nations Security Council (UNSC) resolutions. Key resolutions such as 1540, 1718, and 2231 that set obligations for member states. FATF recommendations. Overview of FATF's recommendations, specifically Recommendation 7, which focuses on counter-proliferation financing. National-level regulations and sanctions. Examples include regulations from the US, OFAC, EU, and other jurisdictions. Financial mechanisms of proliferation financing. Use of front companies. Establishing or utilizing legitimate businesses to disguise illicit transactions and mask the true purpose of financial flows linked to proliferation activities. Dual-use goods financing. Channeling funds through legitimate trade in dual-use goods, items that have both civilian and military applications, to mask their eventual military or WMD-related use. Trade-based money laundering, TBML, exploiting trade activities, for example, over-invoicing, under-invoicing, or misrepresentation of goods, to transfer value or disguise the origins of funds related to proliferation efforts. Complex ownership structures. Employing layered corporate structures across multiple jurisdictions to obscure the beneficial ownership of entities involved in proliferation financing. Use of global financial networks. Leveraging international banking systems, money service businesses, MSBs, and correspondent banking relationships to move funds across borders without raising suspicion. Informal value transfer systems. Utilizing unregulated or informal financial systems like Hawala or other underground banking networks to transfer funds outside of formal channels. Case Study 1. North Korea's evasion of sanctions. North Korea's nuclear weapons program has been sustained through a sophisticated network of front companies, shell corporations, and illicit trade, allowing the country to circumvent international sanctions imposed by the United Nations, UN, and other global powers. Despite stringent measures aimed at cutting off financial and material support for its weapons of mass destruction, WMD programs, North Korea has successfully evaded sanctions and continued financing its nuclear ambitions. The regime's evasion techniques are diverse and involve leveraging weaknesses in global financial systems, trade mechanisms, and enforcement. Let's understand red flags, typologies, and practical challenges of countering proliferation financing. Here are some common red flags of proliferation financing. Customer profile and behavior. Newly established entities or shell companies with little or no commercial activity, especially in high-risk industries such as defense or dual-use goods. Inconsistent customer information, including discrepancies between the nature of the business and the goods/services provided or purchased. Customers from high-risk jurisdictions, especially countries under sanctions or embargoes related to WMD proliferation. Transactions and payment patterns. Complex payment structures involving multiple intermediaries or jurisdictions, especially when these steps do not seem necessary for the transaction. Transactions that are inconsistent with the stated business activity of the customer, for example. Large, frequent transactions in sectors like defense or electronics for a company in an unrelated sector. Overly complicated trade transactions that include opaque invoicing or involvement of entities from multiple countries with no clear economic rationale. Trade and shipping activity. Unusual shipping routes or destinations, particularly those associated with countries or regions subject to international sanctions, e.g., North Korea, Iran. Mismatch between goods and destination, e.g., advanced technology products being shipped to countries with limited technological infrastructure. Goods associated with dual-use technology, i.e., items that could have both civilian and military applications, being purchased or shipped to sanctioned countries. Proliferation financing typologies refer to the methods, techniques, and strategies used to raise, move, and disguise funds for the development or acquisition of weapons of mass destruction, WMD, and their delivery systems. These typologies often exploit gaps in global financial systems, international trade, and regulatory frameworks. Common typologies of proliferation financing include but not limited to use of front or shell companies. Description: proliferators frequently establish front or shell companies that appear legitimate but are specifically designed to facilitate illicit transactions. These companies may have little to no actual business operations and are used to disguise the true nature of transactions. Mechanism: these entities purchase dual-use goods, items with both civilian and military applications, or WMD-related materials while presenting themselves as conducting legitimate trade. The companies often operate in jurisdictions with weak oversight. Example: a shell company is established in a country with lenient corporate disclosure requirements to purchase equipment that can be used in nuclear enrichment processes. Trade-based proliferation financing, TBPF. Description: this involves using international trade to move funds, goods, and technology linked to WMD development. It exploits the complexity of global trade systems to conceal illicit activities. Mechanism: techniques such as over or under-invoicing, multiple invoicing for the same goods, false declarations of goods, or transshipment through third-party countries are commonly used. These methods create layers of transactions to obscure the connection between the financing entity and the proliferation activities. Example: goods like chemicals or advanced machinery are shipped to a low-risk jurisdiction and then re-exported to sanctioned countries using falsified documents. Exploitation of weak financial systems or jurisdictions. Description: proliferators take advantage of countries with weak regulatory frameworks, lax enforcement, or limited sanctions implementation to conduct proliferation-related activities. Funds are routed through banks or financial institutions in these jurisdictions, taking advantage of the lack of oversight or weak enforcement of anti-money laundering, AML, and countering the financing of terrorism, CFT measures. Example: a proliferation network moves funds through financial institutions in a jurisdiction that does not fully comply with international sanctions related to WMD. Case study: Proliferation Financing, Venezuela and Iran collaboration. Venezuela has been implicated in proliferation financing through its alleged collaboration with Iran, particularly concerning the development of weapons and missile technology. While Venezuela itself is not known to be actively developing nuclear weapons, its relationship with Iran has raised concerns about potential proliferation risks. The cooperation between these two countries, both subject to international sanctions, highlights how states can exploit financial networks and circumvent restrictions to support illicit activities, including weapons development. Detecting and preventing proliferation financing presents a range of challenges for governments, financial institutions, and international bodies. The clandestine nature of such activities, coupled with complex financial techniques, makes it difficult to identify and disrupt PF-related transactions. Below are some of the key practical challenges in detecting proliferation financing. 1. Dual-use goods and technology. Challenge. Many materials and technologies involved in proliferation financing are classified as dual-use goods, meaning they can have both civilian and military applications. For example, chemicals or electronics can be used for both industrial purposes and in the development of WMDs. Impact. Difficulty in identifying risk. Financial institutions often struggle to distinguish between legitimate commercial trade and transactions that support proliferation. The trade of dual-use goods can appear routine, making it hard to identify when the goods are intended for WMD programs. Lack of expertise. Banks and regulators may lack the technical knowledge to identify red flags related to the trade of dual-use goods, especially when documentation does not explicitly indicate a military use. Example: a company purchasing industrial centrifuges may appear to be engaging in regular manufacturing activities. However, those same centrifuges could be diverted for uranium enrichment in a nuclear weapons program. Without deep knowledge of the end user or specific goods, the financial transaction appears normal. 2. Use of front companies and complex corporate structures. Challenge. Proliferators often use front companies, shell companies, or complex corporate structures to disguise the true nature of their activities. These companies often operate in multiple jurisdictions with weak or varied regulatory frameworks, making it difficult to trace the ultimate beneficiaries or end users. Impact. Obscured ownership. Financial institutions may have difficulty identifying the beneficial owner or the true purpose of a transaction when it involves multiple layers of ownership across different countries. Limited customer due diligence. CDD. Inadequate CDD processes make it challenging for financial institutions to accurately assess the legitimacy of entities involved in high-risk transactions, especially when companies appear legitimate on the surface but serve as fronts for illicit activities. Example: a front company based in a free trade zone might be set up to import industrial equipment ostensibly for peaceful purposes. However, this equipment could be transferred to another entity engaged in WMD development, bypassing financial scrutiny by exploiting jurisdictional gaps and trade documentation irregularities. Three. Trade-based proliferation financing, TBPF. Challenge. Proliferation financing is often masked as legitimate international trade. Techniques such as over-invoicing, under-invoicing, false documentation, or multiple shipping routes are employed to move funds and goods without raising suspicion. Impact. Difficulty in monitoring trade transactions. Financial institutions typically have limited visibility into the physical movement of goods or their final destination. Transactions related to TBPF are hard to distinguish from legitimate trade-based activities, especially when the goods have non-military uses. Limited access to trade information. Banks may not have access to full trade documentation, such as bills of lading or customs data, that could indicate discrepancies between the declared and actual nature of the traded goods. Example: a bank might finance a letter of credit for the export of industrial machinery to a seemingly legitimate buyer in a third country. The goods are later diverted to a sanctioned entity involved in WMD proliferation. Without comprehensive information about the true end user or cargo, financial institutions are unaware of the illicit nature of the trade. Let's look at some of the best practices for financial institutions and regulatory oversight. First one is applying risk-based approach. Applying RBA to proliferation financing. Integrating proliferation financing (PF) risk assessments into an existing AML/CFT framework using a risk-based approach (RBA) involves systematically evaluating and addressing risks associated with the financing of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction (WMD). Customer due diligence (CDD) and enhanced due diligence (EDD), identifying high-risk customers and transactions, and conducting additional scrutiny where required. Second is implementing effective controls. Sanction screening. Best practices for implementing sanctions lists, such as those from OFAC and the UN, to prevent business with blacklisted entities. Transaction monitoring and alert systems. Tailoring monitoring systems to detect unusual activity related to PF, for example, sudden changes in trade patterns, involvement of high-risk goods or jurisdictions. Third is interinstitutional cooperation. Public-private partnerships. The importance of cooperation between financial institutions and regulators to share intelligence on PF threats. Last but not the least is industry guidelines and best practices. FATF guidelines. Practical steps to comply with FATF's PF recommendations. Regulatory audits and stress tests. Preparing for PF-focused regulatory reviews and audits. Staff training. Continuous training to raise awareness of PF risks and typologies across financial institutions. Proliferation financing is a major concern for global security and is addressed through various international frameworks and agreements aimed at preventing the spread of dangerous weapons. Keep learning at LearningTabs.